Hello and welcome to the seminar and lecture series. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us today from. I am Sarthak Bagchi. I teach here at the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you for a very exciting panel discussion today as part of the seminar and lecture series at Ahmedabad University. And with me, we have today a very distinguished panel of uh, Professor of Development Studies as well as a Professor of Economics to talk about a very interesting topic of on gender and uh, and the labor force and the workforce. So to describe more about today's topic and the research and the importance of why this topic is so relevant to the contemporary times, and it is so important for us to understand the topic for discussion today. We have with us Professor Patrick French, the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. And I would now ask Professor Patrick French to please elaborate and explain a little bit about the topic for today's discussion, which is called North, South, East, and West.
Thanks very much, Satak. So I wanted to talk really not only about North, South, East, West, the idea of a global study of gender, and not even necessarily about the specific question in an Indian context that Dr. Alice Evans is addressing, which is what may explain the various gender divergences between North and South India, to put those broad geographical categories, because my colleague, Professor Leah Matthew, will shortly introduce Dr. Evans and also Professor Jimol Uni, who will be following her in responding to the same question. The point that I wanted to make really was both to undergraduate and graduate students of the university and also to colleagues from different schools who've joined today's discussion. And that was really how valuable it is to try to do a large-scale project of the kind that Dr. Alice Evans is working on now. I believe it's an 8-year project for Princeton University Press, in which she is attempting a global history of gender. And I think one of the things that we all get taught in academia, particularly at the PhD stage, is the idea that you don't want to make any large academic or intellectual commitments, that you want to marshal your evidence and you want to very carefully think about how you look at it. And the risk, it seems to me, of that approach to academic life is that you can always think, well, I don't know enough in order to try to draw conclusions. And I think it is inspirational to have somebody at a mid-career stage trying something so ambitious. And I'm sure that some of the questions that are being asked, for example, the possible explanations around poverty or colonial rule, kinship, and so on, will be interrogated by Dr. Evans in her presentation. And I guess she'll come out sort of more in favor of some against others. I'm sure there'll be people who are part of the seminar who will question the categories themselves and say, well, you should be asking very different questions. But I think really by way of introduction, all I wanted to say was to applaud the ambition, applaud the idea of investigating so many different approaches, and being ready to, from a social science point of view, to sort of question and override your priors on particular issues in order to try to come out with a large picture. So we look forward to the book and we look forward to the seminar. And I would now ask Professor Leah Matthew to do the introduction.
Thank you, Patrick. I will be welcoming and introducing Alice Evans and Jimol Uni. Dr. Alice Evans is a lecturer at King's College London and faculty associate at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research areas include policy and international development, and she's currently writing a global history of gender. Jimol Uni is professor of economics at Ahmedabad University. Earlier, she was director at the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, IRMA, and RBI chair, professor of economics at IRMA. She holds a PhD and MPhil in economics, was a postdoctoral fellow at Economic Growth Center, Yale University. She's currently a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics, constituted by the Government of India. Her research addresses issues of informalization of labor and the gender implications of it, returns to education, social protection, and women entrepreneurship. Trained as an economist, she's turned to blogging to unshackle her writing from an academic, factual, data-based style to a free-flowing one. And that holds for Alice Evans as well, who, as Sarthak just pointed out, part of her work is now doing the rounds on YouTube in a Hindi translation, which is wonderful. Welcome, Alice and Jimol. So Alice will speak for 20 minutes and she'll be followed by Jimol. And after that, we'll be opening it up for questions. Alice?
Thank you so much and welcome to everyone. Though I can't see you, I'm so glad that you've invited me. Right, so here is our central discussion. Why are North and South India so different on gender? Because Southern and Northeastern Indian women are much more likely to survive infancy, be educated, marry later, choose their own husbands, interact more closely with their husbands, bear fewer children, own more assets, exercise more control over their dowry, socialize with friends, move more freely in their communities, and work alongside men. Whereas in the North and Northwest India, women are much more constrained and the sex ratios are far higher. Even if a woman completes secondary school, she is less likely to choose her husband if she lives in the North. Now, these regional trends do not hold for all aspects of gender. Female political representation and independent property ownership is low nationwide. But we do find these regional characteristics, and they have deep roots. Even in the 1900s, girls were more likely to survive infancy, go to school, and marry later if they lived in the South or Northeast. So, what explains India's gender divergence? Now, what I want to do in this talk is consider all the possible explanations and sort of assess the evidence behind each one. And we can assess which of them might be slightly more plausible. So, first of all, we're going to consider poverty, then colonialism, matrilineal, cousin marriage, conquests, labor-intensive cultivation, and also ancestral crop yields. Right, so let's consider the first hypothesis. Is the North more patriarchal because it's poorer? Now, poverty can thwart progress towards gender equality. Poor girls usually quit school early, bear many children, become burdened by childcare, and then struggle to accumulate the capital, the networks, the knowledge to challenge dominant men. So, does poverty explain India's gender divergence? Well, some states, like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, are very poor. But expenditure is also low amongst northeastern hill tribes, and yet women exercise great autonomy and move freely in their communities. Meanwhile, Haryana and Punjab are two of the richest states in India with the worst child sex ratios. And sex ratios are actually worsening in the Northwest alongside economic growth. Regardless of household income, a woman is less likely to have been at school if she lives in the North. The gender gap is also far higher in the North. Now, female education is improving in the North, and we might expect that to translate to rising female employment and autonomy, but it does not. Rural women gain status by retreating from the labor force. So counterintuitively, women in wealthier families have less physical and less economic autonomy. So, in sum, I don't think poverty can explain India's gender divergence. Rather, local gender norms mediate responses to economic growth. Now, let's consider another hypothesis, colonialism. Now, there are several ways that colonialism might have compounded the gender divergence, but none of them seem to track with this north-south difference. So, for example, Brahmin elites entrenched patriarchal interpretations of scripture in Bombay and Madras, prescribing widows' inheritance. But Southern women are still much more autonomous than their compatriots in Bengal. Now, progressive reforms were initiated under colonialism, raising the age of marriage, for example, but women's mobilization and implementation of those progressive reforms was strongest in areas that were already more gender equal. Now, another possibility is that direct colonial rule compounded caste-based stratification. But again, that's not correlated with contemporary gender relations. So none of these different colonial regimes, whether it's in terms of land tenure or governance systems, track this north-south divide. So for me, at least, I think we need to go further back, because that north-south divide pre-exists colonialism. So what about kinship and matrilineal? Now, that certainly helps, and a few Indian communities are matrilineal in the northeasterly hills and the southwesterly coast. Now, in those matrilineal communities, men govern, but women remain relatively autonomous. They can move freely in their communities, enjoy premarital sexual freedoms, marry later, easily divorce, and often live in their natal village. So with fewer strictures on their movements in Kerala, girls rushed to school and led the way in female literacy. But within India, matrilineal communities are a minority. So that's not going to explain the huge north-south differences. In Tamil Nadu, for example, women report great freedom of movement and labor force participation despite being patrilineal. So matrilineal, I don't think that's going to get us there. Let's consider another hypothesis, number 3, cousin marriage. So there's this very, very famous paper that tries to explain the north-south difference by Dyson and Moore. They've got over 2,000 citations, and they say the answer is cousin marriage. South Indians idealize cousin marriage, so Southern women are more likely to be surrounded and supported by their natal family, whereas in the North, women have to go off, marry outsiders to become vulnerable strangers. So could those different kinship systems explain India's gender divergence? What do you think? To be honest, I am not persuaded. Gender gaps in education are larger when brides move out. But neither East nor West India have much cousin marriage, and yet their gender gaps in education are almost as small as the South's. So there is evidence that women from communities that allow intra-village marriage are more likely to travel freely, earn cash income, but that's just a correlation. As far as I'm aware, no one has traced the causal process by which endogamy, cousin marriage, intra-village marriage, enhances autonomy. There could be something else in those communities which advances both gender equality and cousin marriage. So, in fact, there are many other features of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka that could have enhanced gender equality, such as their high labor force participation. And in the absence of those conditions, cousin marriage doesn't seem to enhance gender equality. Consider the Middle East or North Africa. Cousin marriage is practiced by 1/3 of Middle Eastern families, and it ensures that female inheritance under Islam doesn't fragment patrilineal assets. But in the Middle East, bound by cousin marriage, kinship groups share honor collectively. A woman's impropriety shames the entire lineage, and thus women are veiled, monitored, and secluded. So my reading of the evidence is that Southern women may have gained autonomy despite cousin marriage, not because of it. For me, it seems that a woman can be surrounded by her kin, but not necessarily more autonomous or better protected. So I'm personally not very persuaded, for me at least, but I'd be interested to hear what you think, that cousin marriage begets gender equality. So now let's turn to our 4th hypothesis, conquest. Now, foreign armies repeatedly invaded India for more than 800 years, and the North was much more affected than the South. Mughal rule was concentrated in North India on the upper Gangetic plain. Rivers facilitated Akbar's conquests to Bengal's fertile soils, while the Deccan constrained progress further south. Now, women were captured in those raids. Wives and daughters were sent to Damascus as sex slaves. Affluent households, merchants and cultivators often kept a few female slaves. These were used as mules for farming, fetching water, smearing cow dung on the floor, disposing of human waste, and for sex. And if these women were beautiful or young or talented singers, they were often sold as concubines to nobles. Now, from the 10th century, the Rajputs of Rajasthan, who were the subject of the very early attacks, started practicing Johar, women's self-immolation, to prevent military capture and preserve their honor. So I think that's one part of it. These raids cultivated support for purdah. And another part of it is during Mughal rule, North Indian society became much more gender segregated. Now, since the ruling class practiced purdah, it came to signify status. Upwardly mobile families followed suit to symbolize respectability in an age of insecurity. Now, India's caste-based society was already concerned by purity. If women were degraded by outsiders, male kin lost honor. So women increasingly concealed their bodies, lowered their gaze, averted their eyes, and were chaperoned. And if they could afford it, avoided mixing with strangers. And that segregation over the generations amplified gender inequalities. Female education fell, men dominated the public sphere. Women were physically secluded, and that gender segregation persists through widely shared expectations of social sanction. You know, in the 1970s in Delhi, fathers might worry that a girl's education would worsen her marriage prospects because other families might think she was no longer obedient. So over the generations, these ideas of low female education, physical seclusion, those ideals of female respectability would have become ingrained. And so growing up, seeing that kind of social surveillance and policing, observing their families, children learn that defiance is heavily punished. And so then girls learn to speak softly, show restraint, and respect their elders. And even if women are privately critical, Northern women's autonomy is constrained by arranged marriage and the watchful eyes of joint families, which are much more common in the north. And even if women want to venture out, cities in the north like Delhi and Haryana, women experience relentless sexual harassment. So again, that mitigates against women's mobility in the public sphere. And if women remain secluded, they're much less likely to collectively critique or challenge their subordination. So women workers in Haryana do not always question gender wage gaps. And there's a 19th century saying in Haryana saying, women as cattle bound, working and enduring all. So even if women are working, they may not be collectively criticizing and challenging these patriarchal ideas, such as man eating first. But, so I think these conquests, these raids, this prestige bias may have motivated Purdah in the north. But I must add a caveat. One, even before the raids, Purdah was observed by a few royal households in the north. Secondly, many of these patriarchal practices like prepubescent marriage or prescriptions on widow remarriage, long predated the invasions. And the Mughals were actually criticized sati, and some even banned it. And thirdly, let me add, despite a shared history of Purdah, women's labor force participation actually varies a lot across the north. And that could be rooted in traditional agriculture. So this is number 4. So looking at the evidence, we find that female labor force participation is higher in states with traditions of labor-intensive cultivation. Now, farming is really important because before the modern era, before you and I were chatting on Zoom, or everyone produced their own food. And the system for producing food was the most fundamental way in which gender ideologies became entrenched. So where women's contribution to farming was relatively significant, such as shifting cultivation in the northeast or wet paddy fields in the south, they have much higher labor force participation today. Whereas where men were integral to production, in wheat fields, for example, and plough cultivation, which is much more common in the north, women stayed at home. And over the centuries, those gender divisions of labor became entrenched. So I think that's part of it, that women were needed in the fields in the south, and so that normalized women outside the home. But let me add a caveat, because crop suitability, geography is not destiny. In Europe, North America, Latin America, agriculture was also male dominated, just as it was in North India. But during industrialization, women left family farms in search of new economic opportunities. What was different was culture, because that occurred in North America and Europe and Latin America in the absence of social constraints, such as purdah, purity, and caste-based social policing. But before we dismiss geography entirely, let me add the fifth hypothesis, which again surprised me and I found interesting: semi-arid soils. Now, Gautam Hazarika finds that in districts, and others find that in districts with historically low yields, girls are disproportionately likely to die. Lower yields historically, before we had irrigation, worse sex ratios. Now, why might that be? Well, one possibility, though I'm not sure, and this is just a speculation, is that pastoralism was historically pervasive in northwest India. And pastoral societies tend to be very gender segregated. Men take the herds to pasture while women stay at home, tending to newborn animals, processing ghee. Men leave for a few days, searching for new pasture. And if men are away, if they can't observe women's whereabouts, they may worry about paternity and try to control female sexuality. Indeed, Anke Becker, surveying societies across the world, finds that societies that were historically pastoral tend to have stronger son preference, more likely to believe in male superiority. So these practices, which were common in Rajasthan, common amongst the Jats, of pastoralism may help explain these ideas of female seclusion and monitoring of women's behavior. Pastoralism may have even influenced India's caste system. Brahmins, today they dominate business, public service, politics, the judiciary. And interestingly, genetic data suggests that Brahmins have some contributions from steppe pastoralists, and they comprise a larger share of the population in North India, for example. So over the centuries, those ideas of male superiority may have become entrenched. Generations of North Indian women being breastfed for shorter periods. But I must add, again, geography is not destiny. This idea of ancestral crop yields only explains 12% of the total variation in sex ratios. They can't explain why so many girls are missing in the fertile soils of the Ganges, for example. So these are all sort of interlocking, mutually reinforcing factors. I just raise it as another possibility. So let me summarize. So we've discussed 5 different possibilities, right? And I don't claim to know the answer. But what we find is this curious regional divergence, that for centuries, northern men have been fundamental to household survival, entitled to scarce resources, and preserved their honor through female seclusion. To me, that seems to be a legacy of wheat cultivation, deep tillage, pastoralism, patrilineal, patrilocal kinship, caste-based policing, and invasions. Northern parents increasingly today support their daughters' education, but this is primarily to improve their marriage prospects, not to work outside the home. In Rajasthan, female labor force participation is relatively high in family farms, but very low in towns where women would mix with non-kin. So that gender segregation entrenches inequalities because it curbs exposure to women demonstrating their equal competence in socially valued domains, and it inhibits collective critique of patriarchal norms. Whereas in the southern cities, women are visibly earning money, providing for their families, and that is rooted in the historical absence of purdah and labor-intensive wet rice agriculture. Now, paid work is no panacea, because, even without their own property, women may still feel trapped in abusive relationships. But by harnessing their social networks, because they're already out in the public sphere, Southern women have organized against discrimination, demanding dignity, safer cities, and greater respect. So in Mumbai, for example, 33 NGOs mobilized for the right to pee, advocating free, clean, and safe toilets for women, asserting their right to the public space. Thank you. So those are my ideas, but I'm very keen to hear other people's. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Jimol?
All right. After that very fascinating presentation by Alice Evans, I cannot even pretend to, attract as much attention as she has through this really huge global project that she has. And then again, like Leah said earlier, I am constrained by being an economist. So we are shackled by all this data and having to find cause-effect relationships and so on. So I can't paint this really glorious picture that Alice has been painting. But I must say that I've been working on women's participation in agriculture, informal sector, non-agricultural sector, and so on for, 20, maybe 30 years. And so I have read, even though I'm an economist, I've read most of the rest of the literatures, anthropology and history and sociology and so on and so forth. And I must say that, none of these arguments really came as a surprise to me, since I've been seeing this. And I think most of us would have seen some part of this logic we have heard earlier. Also, a lot of work has already been done in this area. And one of the very early books that I read when I started to do my, or maybe a little after that, when I was working on, women's participation in agriculture, was a book by Veena Agarwal, actually, on what is it called, A Field of One's Own. I still have that really thick book, where she has these beautiful maps, that she has shown about uh, all these kind of. She has looked at cultural ethnographic stuff and tried to map the differences across regions in India. There is Pranab Bardhan, who has shown the link, a paper which shows a link between cropping pattern and sex ratios. So there are a whole series of such this thing. And of course, I'm at this point in time only quoting economists, but others as well who have shown, and discussed many of these things. And so one of the, while it's a fantastic global project that you're trying out, it might be useful to take, I don't know, maybe that's an economist point of view, take particular variables and try to see what could be the effect of that. Like, for example, if you take sex ratio, worker population ratio, and kind of dowry patterns, these are all kind of little bit of indicators of inequality in some sense, and they all impact each other in some fashion. But if you take property rights, then they might have some structural features before pre-embedded features which might be affecting it, for example, the kinship relationships, then all your idea of cousin marriage or whatever is those marriage patterns which were happening. Some of those might be affecting. So I'm just saying that taking a single indicator or a couple of indicators and trying to find reasons for why that pattern is the way it is might be another way of doing it, going about it. But this fascinating idea about labor-intensive agriculture, rice versus wheat, is an interesting hypothesis that we've heard before. So, while you have been sort of hitting the internet, taking the internet by storm, so to say, Sarthak and all were talking about the Hindi translation. Leah was talking about Hindi translation of your blog. There have been a lot of criticisms going on the internet as well. And I read some of them. Not that I, agree with all of what they're saying, but there was one interesting question that somebody asked without a name on it. I said that if rice cultivation is leading to gender discrimination, why does Japan and southern China, two notably rice cultivating cultures, have such sexist societies? So, and then he asked this question, is southern China less sexist than northern China? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's in, can you take this forward in your global project that, okay, rice versus wheat or labor intensive versus makes a difference to gender inequality? So as now I'll go to my economist narrow explanations of women's participation. So one explanation for low female workforce participation is, of course, this measurement issue. So there have been a lot of people starting with Devaki Jain who've been talking about this. But more recently, Ashwini and Nela Kabir had this thing about low workforce participation due to a lack of measurement of unpaid work. This is also an argument which has been there for quite some time. And they have done a household kind of survey in 7 districts of West Bengal. And they try to disentangle the impact of strands of choice for the woman, her constraints posed by domestic work and care responsibilities. And they try to document the fuzziness in the borders between paid work and domestic and unpaid work. And look at it in terms of the cultural kind of context which is existing there. So basically they say that, and also women are engaged in, according to them, expenditure saving activities. Like, for example, they may be doing, small plots of land, kitchen gardens to take, get their local, their fruits, vegetables, whatever, or they might be doing food processing, again, to save expenditure on. So a lot of this does not get counted in our measurement of workforce participation. And they also find that religion and the visible markers like the whale were not significantly determinants of the probabilities of working for women. And on the other side, they said that there was a great demand for work actually, but then their demand for work was they wanted it in the kind of activities that they would like to do closer to home and so on. So some kind of an unmet demand for work is also another. So far, most of what you are saying and most of what I've been saying so far is talking about the level of workforce participation between the North and the South, or North and Northeast, and so on. But the question that is being debated today, particularly in India, is that we have been seeing a declining labor force participation of women. And what explains this declining labor force participation? Now, the economists have a very classic way of defining this, of trying to understand this in terms of the income effect and the substitution effect. And there are n number of these papers, but then there's one by Stephen Klassen and Peters in 2015. It's a World Bank paper. It explains the stagnation of female labor force participation in urban India. And they're looking at female labor force participation between 1987 and 2011. And they say that on the supply side, they find that there are rising male incomes and education, and that is contributing to a withdrawal of women from the workforce. And this is what we call a classic income effect. As the income goes up, women withdraw from the labor force. But then there is also, it is also possible that on the demand side, there has been a decline in the share of agriculture and manufacturing, which might which are activities in which women are engaged. More women are engaged in these activities, and that could then create what I would like to call a discouraged worker effect, in the sense that women actually withdraw from the labor force. So other than the income effect, the other effect which is supposed to have a positive impact on workforce participation is the substitution effect. So generally it is considered that when education goes up, the opportunity cost of time for women staying at home goes up, and so they enter the workforce. We also see this U-shaped relationship with education and income. That is, when with education and labor force participation, you also have that with regard to income. So, but what is happening here is that this positive substitution effect is not happening, and women don't seem to be, with the levels of education rising in India, women don't seem to be entering in that proportion. So the balance between this income and substitution effect ends up with having a decline in the labor force participation rather than an increase in labor force participation with the economic growth. And the explanations for that could be an expansion in labor supply, so that there are already too many people out there. But it could also be rising marriage market returns to education, so that all the women who are getting educated are not necessarily wishing to enter the labor market. But I would agree with the negative substitution effect idea of a discouraged worker kind of effect, and which Klassen is actually hinting at by saying that we have had a decline in the shares of agriculture and manufacturing over this period, and that could explain that women are actually not offering themselves for work because just the demand is not there. So let us just look at, I'll just share a couple of graphs looking at this. Like I said, we are, as economists, slightly constrained by data and so on. So just to look at this and look at, so this is workforce participation rate. Now, there are many issues here. One that, which data source you are using also determines the workforce participation rate you obtain. So this is the National Sample Survey data. If you look at the census data, the workforce participation of women is lower. If you look at the Center for Monitoring Economy, the rural labor force participation rates they are showing is much lower. So the whole measurement issue that Nella and all were talking about is definitely an issue. Now, if you look at this NSSO data, this is between 2004-5 and 17-18. So we are really getting 4 data points here, which is almost 15 or more years. And I've clubbed these into southern and northern states, and also into west, central, and eastern states. So the southern states definitely have higher labor force participation, more or less, than the northern states. As you can see, the highest here was 50, and here it's 30. And Haryana, you see this very sharp decline, and the southern states are having higher workforce participation rate. But they're not the only ones. If you look at the west and central region, you see this very high participation in Chhattisgarh and in Maharashtra, and then in Rajasthan. So these are areas which are not rice producing. These are, so this north-south divide is these the south states are rice producing, labor intensive, and these north states are more wheat, though of course UP has rice in the east side. But these western states are not the rice producing states, and they have very, very large tracts of semi-arid land, which is rain-fed regions. And these have very high labor force participation. So you were dismissing the poverty angle, but is there a poverty angle to this as well? And if you look at workforce participation rate across countries and across time, across per capita expenditure or per capita income, you'll find a U-shaped relationship. That is, workforce participation of women is higher in poor households, then it declines, and then it goes up again among very rich households, most probably because they have very high levels of education. But I basically want to turn to the level story is this, that there are other states which have high labor force participation rates too. If you look at the eastern states, I couldn't get the Northeast because the sample sizes there for Northeast are extremely small. I didn't want to use that. They do have participation a little higher than the northern states, but not that high either. So like, for example, if you take this Bihar is a classic case, which has extremely low workforce participation rate. But I wanted to look at the change so do these socio-cultural rice-wheat distinction between north-south also affect the decline in the workforce participation rate? So if it is due to these cultural differences, then do we expect a higher decline in labor force participation in the northern states as compared to the southern states? Do the women are more likely to withdraw at the drop of a hat in north rather than the south? So the same table I have, I've just constructed. This is both rural and urban. What I was showing you was the graph was only rural. So I've just looked at the percentage point difference. I have not calculated anything. It's just a percentage point difference between the north, south, east, west. And you see that most of the states have shown a decline. So most of this rural is negative. The urban is more or less negative, but less so. Their rates are in any case very much lower. So if you look at this, you really don't see that much of a decline in difference between the north and the south. So the north is here, 16, 18, 12. And the only, south, and the only North Indian state which has a very sharp decline is actually Haryana. And Haryana in any case is one of the worst among those North Indian states. But then if you look at the central region, which also had high labor force participation rates, they also have very similar declines, except again, Gujarat, which had a very, very high labor force participation rate. Then if you look at the urban, the declines are, urban decline is sharper in the north than in the south. That is true. And in the decline in the east is also sharper than in the south. So, I mean, we don't really get that very clear north-south distinction if you want to carry this forward and say that this, whatever your cultural, social, cultural, whatever factors you want to say are affecting the North versus the South, you don't really see that. And we have some oddities, like we had a rise in the urban participation in Andhra, Chhattisgarh, Punjab, Jharkhand, and West Bengal. This West Bengal and Odisha we'll see later again. Yeah, and then I also looked at, now this is a different data source, and this is urban. This is the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy. I wanted to show one more thing here for showing my discouraged worker hypothesis. So this line that you're seeing, these are again southern, northern, western, west central, and eastern states. And workforce participation, urban, CMI, urban workforce is better than their rural. The rural participation rates are extremely low compared to the NSS. So I, am a little suspicious of them. If you see this line that I've drawn for all the three graphs, this is November 2016. And November 2016 was the year we had demonetization. November 2016, the government of India sort of sucked out 85% of the currency in this country. And it led to a complete collapse of economic activity. So when that happened, you see this sharp decline. That's not to say that it wasn't declining. It was kind of, this is only 2014 January, this is monthly, and it goes on till October 18. You can take it forward till today. So if you see this, you'll see this sharp decline in most of the states. And again, there is not really that north-south difference. When the shock hits, then it hits through the country, and all the states have the decline in the labor force participation of women. So then your culture and all your other variables that you're talking about don't seem to. There are some oddities here, and this is my last slide. So the shock of, so this is the same thing, is just giving the percentage point difference. So if you look at the North and the South, the shock of demonetization, like I showed you in the graph, that particular line, all the states had this very, very sharp fall in workforce participation. And there were these two really odd states, which were Odisha and Bengal. And you see it here. Odisha is this yellow thing in this last bottom graph, and Assam is this, and Bengal. So these seem to have risen for some reason. I don't have an explanation for that. But all the states show a decline after this demonetization effect. And the decline in the southern states is actually higher than in the, so if you take a more recent period, that is 14 to 2018, where we had this shock, we actually had one more shock. That was in July 2017, which was the coming in of the GST. And we've done that as well. And you'll see again this decline. And it is much more for women than for men. That is the interesting part about this, macroeconomic shock. So if you look at this North and South, the southern states had a much sharper decline than the northern states, if you see this, except for this Punjab. So I will end here. I'll stop sharing this slide. So when a macro shock hits the country, this so-called north-south differences are not so visible. All the states seem to have that sharp decline. And incidentally, this particular kind of idea of a macro shock has been studied very intensively now by many people. Many papers have come out for this COVID shock, because India is one of those countries which went for this very, very sharp lockdown. I mean, very strict lockdown as compared to all the other countries. If you look at any index, you can find that. And here again, there are papers which have been showing, and we have also been looking at it using the CMI data. This decline in female labor force participation with the COVID shock is again much higher for women than for men. And again, there is no difference across regions or across this so-called north-south decline. So to conclude, the decline in workforce participation rate in urban South was higher than in the urban North. And this goes against our rise, weight, or social cultural logic. Basically, when a shock hits, women are pushed out of the workforce. And so this discouraged worker effect operates, and women do not offer themselves for work, and they move to outside the labor force. So, I mean, it's a different take from yours. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jima. Alice? I think there are a few clarificatory questions and maybe to specific slides. So I think I'll begin with that and then go on to the larger questions. There's one question from Karthik to Alice. Why does Evan say that the North-South difference predate colonialism? How do we know this to be the case? And Jimal, I'll just read out the clarificatory questions addressed to your presentation. This is from Supratim Das. How would you explain labor force participation rates to increase between 2009 and 11 for UP and West Bengal? And the second one, only West Bengal shows an increase in the participation rate for both urban and rural. How can that be explained?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so just to reply to those points. Firstly, on South Asia versus East Asia. So the point is that rice raises female labor force participation because it is labor intensive. There's a lot of work transplanting seedlings, for example. So, but that does not entail female leadership. As I said, regardless of rice agriculture in the South, women's representation is low nationwide. So it is no counter to my argument to say that Japan also has gender inequality. Rice only raises female labor force participation. And that's also true of Southern China. Southern China has rice versus North in the wheat. And so historically in the 1920s, where we have data, female labor force participation was higher in the South. Now, there are additional factors, of course, beyond crop systems that will affect contemporary gender relations. And that's about the nature of economic development and labor demand over the past decades, over the 20th century. I'm just pointing to one historic factor. Now, secondly, there's a point about undercounting. So what usually enhances women's status, their autonomy, and their networking is paid work in the public sphere. And that is always counted. And that is higher in the South. So yes, there is undercounting. There's undercounting of women's home-based work, of women's expenditure-saving activities, of their underpaid agricultural work. Yes, all that is undercounted. But that only tells us about the kinds of work that is not valued or recognized. That tells us what is not contributing to GDP. If you want to know about women's status, look at the work that is counted, and that is much higher in the South. So this is not a problem for me. Now, the third point was saying that women have retreated from the lockdowns all over the world. Women have retreated from the labor force across the world. Yes, you know, women can't take care of the kids and go to work. Yes, this is true. So there are these contemporary shifts that we see all over the world. Women withdrawing from the labor force in response to economic prosperity in the South. Yes. Women not being able to juggle everything all over the world. Yes. What I'm trying to say is that notwithstanding these contemporary shifts, these trends, these behaviors, of course that happens, but we still see these big regional differences in autonomy, women's freedom of movement, and the sex ratios. Those are the specific data points that I'm explaining. And I should add, I should add, in case anyone thinks this is, well, obviously I gave a 20-minute talk, but anyone who checks the blog, you can find all the detailed evidence behind each of these points. So this is all based on careful empirical data. Now, the fourth point is, how do we know that gender relations, regional differences predated colonialism? So, for example, we can look at the age of marriage. We can look at, which was low nationwide, mean age of marriage was 13 in India in 1900, but it was slightly higher in the South. Female education, if we look at literacy rates, educational enrollment, it was higher in the South. Actually took Rajasthan's mean age of marriage only got to about 15 or 16 in the 1970s. So that's about a century after what happened in the South. We can also look at ethnographic evidence. So we can look at data about women's diaries when they traveled to Calcutta and hear about how Anandibai Joshi was pelted with stones when she went to the market in Calcutta. She herself was a Marathi woman. So there's a lot of quantitative and qualitative data that can give us a bit of an insight into what gender relations were like. But thank you for all those points.
There was a question specifically asking about.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
2009-11, I don't think it rose in UP. It was kind of flat and then it falls down later on. It is difficult to explain that increase in participation in West Bengal actually after demonetization or even otherwise. And in Odisha, I don't really have an explanation as to why that is, going against the trend of the decline of all the other states as yet.
I'm going to bring in a student question, and one that I also, because that's something I've been thinking about. Alice, how do you look at this intersectionally? Not just in terms of gender, but that there are elite women, there are Dalit women. How do you look at the intersectionality of gender identities in your work?
Thank you. If I reply now, so that's incredibly important, but these, even if controlling for those differences, even controlling for caste, even controlling for religion, region is the biggest. So there's a famous paper on region, not religion. And so if you compare Muslim and Hindu women in Punjab compared to Tamil Nadu, actually religion does not make a massive difference. Neither does wealth or caste. The region where you live is the biggest driver of sex ratios, education, marrying later. So all of those things matter, but I'm currently trying to emphasize region.
Another question from a master's econ student. While there is much evidence that the extent of female independence is dependent on the nature of agriculture, it's also true that culture evolves. Do you think that tier 1 and tier 2 towns will reverse these quality trends, or will it be preserved because caste networks are preserved even in big cities?
That's a great question. Cities absolutely have the potential to catalyze social change, because when people mix and mingle with diverse others, they hear alternatives, they can become emboldened. Absolutely. So people in cities tend to be much more egalitarian. Also, in college-educated women in cities in India tend to respond to labor demand. So absolutely, cities can catalyze female employment, but it depends on the nature of labor demand. And the moment in India does not have labor-intensive growth. So the opportunity cost, actually, even if a woman is educated, can still remain quite low because there aren't so many jobs. And employers generally prefer to employ men because they perceive them as more reliable or more productive in the absence of childcare. So as long as India does not have labor-intensive growth, then the demand for women will be low. Therefore, the kind of money that they can command in cities will be low. So there's more incentive for them to stay at home, to take care of their children and focus on their children's education. So absolutely, cities can catalyze change, but you also need labor-intensive growth, which we've seen, for example, in much of East Asia.
Jimal, do you have any comments on urbanization?
Right.
And
urbanization is the classic, the solution to many of these problems of these cultural differences being, because your caste and your community is less visible and you are not surrounded by your kin in that sense. So that is considered a increase. In fact, I remember when this lockdown happened, a lot of women who were either studying in universities or working in the city had to go back, and they were not interested in going back because they had this fear that they wouldn't be allowed to come back to the cities. These are small towns. Sorry for the sound. Yeah, but then, there are so many other factors playing up now in India that I think I'll have to. So there are so many other factors playing in India today. The India that I saw like 30 years ago, the kind of hope that we had about the mingling of caste and culture and so on and so forth, has in the last few years sort of, come down. So you cannot say it's not, I don't think it's a linear pattern that just because we have urbanization, there are so many other factors, the political factors and other factors working there that, we can have these ups and downs, and I hope they are ups and downs and not all down.
There are a few more clarificatory questions. One from how is the data for mean age for marriage gathered in the 1900s? Were these colonial surveys? And another one from Manomohini, what time period are you looking at? And one for GMOL, does labor force participation consider issues of migration?
So there are a number of ways that we've tried to calculate the mean age of marriage. One is the colonial surveys, and also what they did subsequently in subsequent decades. They interviewed older women and then asked at what age they married. So there are a number of ways we can try to get at that.
Workforce participation rate. Yes, because it is capturing women wherever they are to the extent that, the measurement can be taken care of. Migration is not an issue. I mean, you're considering the households. Yeah, to the extent that you're saying that if they are not in a household when they are migrated, then they might not be captured. Is that the suggestion? As such, migration should not affect the labor force participation, because you are computing this for each household. So wherever those people are resident, you are taking this survey in that place. And then it's a sample survey. So as such, they will be captured wherever they are. So I really don't see why migration should affect.
Because we have an interdisciplinary audience and everyone is not, fully aware of how surveys are done and
That's right.
all the methodological.
So as such, methodologically, it should not affect them. But then you can say, that the migrant people might be living in kind of habitats which are not captured. They might be in, structures which are not permanent. So they might not be captured there, and so on. So those kind of people might get left out of your surveys. But as such, it does not have an impact on.
Patrick, you wanted to ask?
Oh, yeah, I had a question actually for both speakers, which was to just sort of widen out some of the implications of the research that you have done to date. So for GMOL, I mean, you've spoken about, the sort of macro impact of things like demonetization or the lockdown and so on. But, in that you've been studying these areas for decades, if you were to go back historically, as far as you sort of felt confident in doing so, what would be the main drivers of gender divergence in your view? And then the question that I had for Alice was I know that we're very much focusing on India today, but you've I know been doing this globally. I think Latin America was where your research began. And I just wondered, without sort of going too far off the topic, if you could say something about your sort of tentative early conclusions to your big research question on a global basis.
I'm interested in why some societies are more gender equal than others. And so to explain that, I think we need to look at both deep roots and disruptors. So deep roots are what I talked about, the farming systems, kinship, religion. Disruptors would be things like economic development and democratization. So where you have weak constraints on female mobility, in the absence of caste-based policing, the absence of traditions of purdah, then with economic development, women respond rapidly to shifting opportunity costs. So as fertility falls, as education increases, women go out into the workforce and earn money. And that's certainly what happened in East Asia, in Europe, in Latin America. Also, really important, besides female employment, is democratization. Democratization, cultures of resistance, social mobilization, enable feminist activism. Women can see that they can change the laws of the land. And so that can catalyze protests in Taiwan, in South Korea over Me Too, in Latin America over abortion, in Europe over equal pay, and the same in the USA. So those are the three key points. It's whether you've got strong or weak constraints on female mobility. In South Asia, of course, those constraints are always much higher, like the Middle East. and the nature of economic development. It's only economic development is really important, and that's one reason why sub-Saharan Africa tends to lag behind. Not that it is intrinsically patriarchal, but the poverty is a real constraint there. So 3 key points: the weak constraint, development, and democratization. That's all very important. That's me being crude, right?
So the point that I'm making is that it's not a clear north-south kind of difference. It is a much more nuanced, and the cropping pattern and the fertility of the soil and the kind of work that is done does make a difference. But then also now we are seeing the shift out of agriculture into non-agricultural employment. So the development of non-agricultural employment in the regions also is would make a difference. But so poverty is definitely a factor. So if the semi-arid regions have been for a period of time poor, then they do tend to have higher participation. Then the other thing which is here are the tribals. The tribal populations have always had higher workforce participation rates than normal populations, even overall populations. So again, you'll see these tribal belts, which is again in the central areas of the country. There, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, even this side of Gujarat, you'll see much higher workforce participation rate. And there, it is definitely a cultural phenomenon why women are less secluded and so on in the cultural phenomenon. And then mobilization. So social movements and social mobilization in regions where it has happened, the women's coming out into this thing is much higher. So Kerala is, of course, a classic case of that, a political kind of mobilization, the social movements. So social movements have also happened in Tamil Nadu. I think Karthik will be able to tell us more whether that has done anything to the women's status, because the Dravidian cultural assertion of the lower caste is a phenomenon as well. So political or social mobilization across, and that might be happening in Bengal, though of course Bengal female participation is not so high. But then the rising participation, like they have had certain reforms in their land, like the Barga, the Operation Barga and so on, where the sharecropping was legalized and so on. So some of those things also then help, and that is coming through social mobilization. No positive progressive reform ever in favor of the poor or in favor of labor takes place without some kind of assertion by the groups. So when that happens, then again there is an impact on workforce participation.
A quick question, Arpita. Can we allow folks to unmute and ask questions if they have longer questions? Meanwhile, I'll continue with the questions that have already come in. Jimol, you brought in Kerala. There are a few questions related to that from Pallavi. Do better sex ratios and health indicators of women translate into leadership or powerful positions of women? Because anecdotally, I see that all the good health indicators in Kerala, even with all of that, patriarchy is still very much prevalent there. And again, related to Kerala, there's a comment from Arushi for Alice. One of the indicators you might like to explore in the North-South divergence are family planning statistics. The recent NFHSB data indicates that most southern states have higher female sterilization rates. Kerala has been touted as the classic family planning model with increased women's participation. This could be suggesting more autonomy of contraceptive choice among southern women, which could be interesting to explore within your project.
Now, Kerala is, I did my MPhil in the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. So there were a lot of North Indian people there, and I hail from there, though never really lived there except in Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. And so all the North Indians used to have this joke about Kerala because they had just written that book, which later came to be known as the Kerala model. It was a UN project. It's a very well-known project, was done by it. And so they had this joke, they would say, but in Kerala. So anything you talk about, the next thing would be, but in Kerala, it's different. So it used to be a standing joke in CDS. So which is true. So one of the things about Kerala is that historically, the Maharajas of that time, like the Cochin Maharaja or the Travancore Maharajas, were extremely progressive. So they had, education and health for all. And I can tell you that even in the 60s, and that was carried over when Kerala became a state in 1956. And yeah, I remember as a child, I used to go to Kerala during the summer, and the things used to match the summer holidays. Never used to match. I used to go into school with my cousins. You could go into the school. Schools were convent schools, but they were free, and everybody went to the same school. My cousins went to the school, and the lady who worked in my house, some Neelamma or whatever Amma, their children were in the same school as my cousins, and it shocked me no end because I went to school in Kolkata in this, famous whatever convent school as well, and we were, we had tie and a shoe and white socks and so on, and here were these children. Everybody, so that equality which was there, now it has changed. Now I find people going into private schools, and that whole public system is still there. It's free. Well, वैसे तो it is free in Gujarat also, but that's more recent. So this phenomenon of Kerala and its difference in everything, matrilineal was definitely there because some of the Muslim communities also had a matrilineal system. The Hindu families had a matrilineal system and so on. So it was there, a large proportion of that they did have. And so if you know the Nair community, the girls never left the house. It was the men after they got married. It was the men who came into the house and lived there. So to some extent so Kerala, so it is a but in Kerala. And then, of course, they had the first Communist Party, EMS's first electoral gain was theirs. And with that, every single, trade union movement and agricultural laborers movement, even their agricultural reforms of the 1960s were more comprehensive than anywhere else in the country after independence and so on. So Kerala is a different phenomenon in public health. Again, public health has gone down today. So there's so much more of the Aster and the private health now. Whereas even when I was doing my MPhil, you just walk into the Trivandrum Medical College and you get a free thing. And the facilities were superb, but it's deteriorated. People are going into private sector health. So Kerala is but in Kerala.
Can I just elaborate on my question? Sorry. So this is kind of directed to what Alice has been talking about. Like, when we're looking at empowerment, we're using sex ratios as a measure of empowerment. But the question is, can we? Does it lead to some type of agency of women when we're looking at these health indicators and sex ratios? But because it doesn't always translate. That's my concern.
If I may.
That's why I still feel that workforce participation rate is a better indicator of status, the sex ratio, because sex ratio is then determined by some very historical components. So is labor force participation, but labor force participation is then affected by demand, supply, existing kind of work that is available for women, whether they're close to their homes, outside the homes, and so on. So there's something here is affecting them. Something today is affecting can affect workforce participation. But the sex ratio is predetermined in some sense, because the Kerala sex ratio, one of the few states which has, doesn't have an adverse sex ratio. If you look at their health systems and their education systems and just simply their food systems, what they eat, it makes such a difference. That's why their longevity is so high. So sex ratio is something which is determined, it's not today. It's so that way I would prefer workforce participation rate as an indicator of, social status of women.
So if I may, I don't think we should ever use one single indicator. What we need to do is look at a broad range and really not indicators at all. What really matters is whether whether women are valued, whether they can exercise autonomy, whether they enjoy status. Now, women can be participating in the labor force just as they were in the Soviet Union and Maoist China, but just used as mules, used as workhorses. So workforce participation is not the key thing. We need to look at ethnographic accounts, women's experiences, and also quantitative things of a range of domains. So I would not say, we should never have a debate about which single indicator to use. They're all part of the story. Secondly, the really important point is that Kerala and other southern states can make tremendous progress on family planning and education, yes. Whether the women then move out into their employment really depends on the contemporary nature of economic development. As I was saying earlier, that has not been conducive for employment generation in India. So that is the key problem. And if women remain secluded in their homes, they're less likely to mix and mingle in the public sphere. They're less likely to generate the resources that they need in order to enter politics. If you continue to have those traditions of female seclusion, it's very hard for women to go out into the evenings, organizing political networks, start campaigning, mobilizing, and entering politics. So for those reasons, you can have tremendous progress in education, family planning, but low levels of female employment across South Asia and low levels of governance. But those were great questions. Thank you.
Just a quick note that all of you can ask your questions. You can unmute yourselves and ask now. Mona, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Mine was just a sort of a minor thing about pastoralism, because that was used as one of the sort of indicators of entrenched women's seclusion, etc. But within pastoralist groups also, there's a lot of diversity, because Rabaris, for instance, they're a very different kind of a pastoralist group. They're fast urbanizing, but much more, very different from upper caste groups, where women participate. They're not exactly matrilineal, but the women stay with their families after marriage, etc. They participate in the police force. So, but it also reminds me, so that's a kind of a comment, whether one can generalize about pastoralism. The other point that came to my mind is, Ashutosh Varshney, a political scientist, wrote this very similar sort of an article in 2000, asking this very interesting question, is India more democratic? And he did a kind of a north-south divergence of democracy. And he says, why is democracy, stronger? Or he used Hindu nationalism as one of the indicators. Why is that lesser in South India and greater in North India? And one of the sort of conclusions he came to was the history of caste justice movements in the South. And why that, according to him, played a very big role in, the sort of, the more, the stronger, the basis of caste-based justice in the South compared to the North, and therefore weakening of Hindu nationalism in the South versus the North. And I wonder if that is something that both of you, Jimol and Alice, would you consider that as an interesting historical fact for divergence?
Yes, definitely. That's what I was calling social mobilization. And that is true of very clearly Kerala and Tamil Nadu. I'm not so sure about Karnataka, and Karnataka has anyway got the Hindu party there now. And Andhra, I'm not sure about those two, but definitely Kerala, and Kerala had the Irava movement and all the Palayas and so on, and the Dravida movement in Tamil Nadu. But I don't know about the other two states. It definitely has an impact on women's status.
Alice, you want to comment?
Yes, I think they cut. So I would love someone to systematically assess the evidence about caste-based inequalities in India, because and I was looking at some data recently. We know that there was horrific slavery in the South in the 1900s. There was horrific class-based stratification in the South. But more recent data shows that there is much stronger social mobility in southern as compared to northern India. And there's 2 years ago, there was an issue of EPW where they find lower levels of untouchability in the south. Now, why is this? I don't exactly know, but I think what we've seen is there's stronger social mobility and a decline of untouchability in the south. Now, why is that? Yes, that social mobilization is going to be a key part of it, absolutely. And that social mobilization will have also benefited women, because when they have free education in Tamil Nadu, that means broader literacy, which in turn encourages female education. So that caste-based policing, the caste issue is incredibly interesting. I wish someone would study that. It also benefited women for sure, but that caste-based social mobilization is transformative, but where did it come from? I don't know, but I think it's a fascinating question, and I would love someone more intelligent than me to research it, to study the history of the South and the North in terms of the changes, because I don't think that's the story that I'm telling. It's not a regional divergence with pre-colonial roots. I think it is partly also has more recent roots. So I think that's an important topic.
Shilpa,
Um,
you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. So my question is to Alice. I would want you to, elaborate more, because you gave a kind of a big pattern that you're interested in looking at historical and deep-rooted, what you call as deep-rooted changes. So what is your view about culture as a discursive practice? And the fact that the relational self actually is the relationality is renegotiated at different levels. So in family relationships, the relationality is renegotiated. Relationality allows for a renegotiation of self and agency, and that allows for a renegotiation which expresses itself in work, which expresses itself in higher education, and so on and so forth. Relational self, or construction of relational self, is studied in terms of cultural differences, and this discursive practice can tell how people have responded to changes in the history which you are talking about. What's your view on that?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question? I'm not familiar with these terms like relational renegotiation. Can you just rephrase? You would just use different language. I'm not familiar with that language.
Okay, so discursive practices come from the word discourse, and discursive practices are basically interactions which renegotiate meaning. So for example, if a woman wants to work, or if a woman wants to marry late, or if a woman wants to do whatever, that's her agency. That is what is called in economic terminology. Then this meaning of agency is renegotiated in the relationships in the family. I'm talking about the family level of analysis, right? So this renegotiation is called as a discursive practice. What does it mean to go to work? What does it mean to come back home early? I'm talking about actual concrete interactions which are done day to day, and these change the way women feel empowered or not. And this is related to the question of agency. So how the relational self, and UK has done a lot of research on this. Probably, you could, I don't know, UK has done a lot, European tradition has done a lot of research on discourse, on discursive practices that renegotiate meaning, so that we don't look at self or workforce participation as frozen concepts, but that are renegotiated in day-to-day encounters. I hope I am able to communicate. So discursive practices explain cultural change better than simply historical events. So I thought that probably you're more aligned to that, and so I wanted your view on that.
All right. So as I understand your question, so women negotiating whether they can go to work and get jobs, right? Okay. So I understand that. So of course, so the talk was mainly about the historical deep roots, but
Yes.
of course there are contemporary changes in the world. And so is your question about what enables women to push for increased employment?
No. So my question and a kind of a dialogue with you and a discursive process was that the cultures interact with events such as what you talked about, deep rooted events or deep roots or ancient roots, some words that you used, such that they change the meaning making of self, and that particularly changes, possibly can explain changes in north and south. Although understood, and what I appreciated Gmol's presentation, your hypothesis, a large big picture thing, seems to be that these historical events changed between north and south, especially in reference to what you mention as invasions. So my question to you is that, or my view or my dialogue with you is that, these historical events change the meaning making of cultures about women, about marriages, about families, about public spaces, and therefore you can explain that variation.
Yeah, so maybe if I give an example of education. So for example, in northern areas with a tradition of purdah, education might be seen as dangerous, jeopardizing a woman's respectability because she's going out into the public sphere, potentially sexually harassed, potentially having boyfriends. But maybe the meaning of education changes when men gain education and start wanting educated brides. As Chatterjee talks about, women's education started to be seen as a cultural respectability. So the meaning of education changes along with economic shifts over the 20th century. Would that be one example? But the rate at which that changed varied north and south. With rising male education in the south, the demand for female education was much higher in the south. So maybe that's one way in which the meaning of female education changed in response to the contemporary 20th century developments.
So thank you. Because you mentioned about Anandibai, you would note that, a lot of reformers in Maharashtra were couples, like Jyotiba.
Yes.
So that is what I meant by relational self. Thank you, Leah.
Sorry, thank you for explaining.
Yeah.
Saptam, I think yours will be the last question.
Yeah, good evening. Hello all. So it's not a question actually. I just wanted to know if we can look at the different kind of mythologies or literary texts or deities which became popular in north or in the south of India, and did it affect in any ways the gap, the gender gap that we are talking about?
I think this is a really great question. I think there is absolutely potential for mythologies to reinforce gender inequalities. There actually is a new article coming out by Melanie Zhu in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and she looks at what they've tried to do is code mythologies all over the world for gender bias, and to find out which ones are more gender biased than others. And so it's in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and it's coming out. And I certainly think that's one way in which culture could be transmitted, because it's how children grow up, what they're taught about right and wrong. And so there's certainly, and it's certainly true that there are these mythologies of maybe men being represented as gods in North India as compared to more female goddesses in the South. And I think that could partly play a role in contributing to these gender differences. Now, those regional differences in mythologies may likely, but what do they come from? They don't just, vanish out of nothing. So I guess part of it is trying to understand the deep roots behind that. But I think it's a great point. And I think it's likely to have played a role as well, absolutely.
So I was reading about the Sangam literature, and out of about 400 or 450 authors, 27 are identified as women, and there are about 100, which is 25%, which are anonymous. Which, that's long back, and it suggests that about 5% of the authors could read and write and even express themselves at that point in time. And looking today at nearly 5% of CEOs of Fortune 500, I think we have made no progress, looks like.
So Saptam, I'm reading this book, and you should read it. It's by Natalie Haynes. It's called The Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths. And she goes around moving from various women characters and goddesses in the myth, in the Greek myth. And she says how they are so badly represented. And then she goes through a whole lot of texts and try to explain exactly what happened to. So the Pandora's jar. Why is she such a terrible character? She opened that box and everything went wrong. And similarly, in the Oedipus, right, the famous mother complex thing. So that the mother who became his wife, Jakota, the story about her, how little we know about that. So you should really read this book. And she goes through some 10 such mythological characters in the Greek history where the women, the character of that woman, this thing is underplayed. And she finds it in various poems and other, early writings and tries to make a different story out of each of that. I'll soon be writing a blog on it.
Our last comment will be from Manamohini, historian.
Hi, thanks, Leah. No, just very quick. I know we're running out of time. So thank you very much, both of you, for a very interesting presentation. I maybe you said it, I couldn't catch it. So one of the things for Dr. Evans is I could not catch what time period you're considering. That's one. And for GMOL, I had a question about migration and LFPR, because since in the context of being talking about northern and southern cultural divides, which you seem to suggest does not exist. So
no, sorry, it exists. I'm saying that's not the only divide.
Okay, right. So in that context, so I thought that do economists, and I don't know really how you do it. Do you consider people? So for instance, I work in Ahmedabad, but I'm not from Ahmedabad. Right. So do you consider things like that when you calculate? Because you seem to be talking about cultural differences or differences in patterns geographically. So that was the basis of the question. Thank you.
So Alice?
Yeah, thank you. So for my side, I'm looking at, I looked at contemporary data over this regional differences in gender across a broad range of indicators and ethnographic work, and also took that back as far as I could. So I was even reading art history books about representations of Rajputs and seeing that only men were represented in paintings, for example. So I really tried to explore as much evidence and data as I could, going far back to really try to understand the roots of this regional divergence. But I wish someone would take it further, because there's still much more to do, I'm sure.
So Manamohini, on this migration thing, so like you and I are migrants into the state, right? But we would be captured here where we are in Gujarat. The problem rises with seasonal migrants, temporary migrants, people who move in and out and so on. Where are they captured? So all surveys will have a very clear definition of who is a member of the household, because most of these are done through household surveys. So it might be that, somebody who has lived in that place for 6 months or 8 months or whatever is considered a member of that household. In fact, I'm a member of this standing committee on statistics, on economic statistics, and we had a big issue with regard to this pandemic because we in fact introduced a new question into the periodic labor force survey of this one, 2021. To capture if people had come into the house for a short period of time during this COVID time. We've actually introduced questions like that. So there's a short block only in this particular survey, this is a periodic, this is what gives us our labor force data, right? It's quarterly estimates are coming out now on this. So we actually introduced this question purely because of this fact that people had come into the thing and stayed there for 3 months, 6 months or something like that, which normally we would not capture them in that household because they have not lived there for that considered period of time.
Thank you. That's all I needed to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jimol and Alice. We're at 6:31, so I'll invite Sarthak, but just a big thank you to both Alice and Jimol, and also a special thanks to Patrick. who put this together really. Sarthak?
Yeah, just to come in and echo in Leah's words, and thank you so much. And I think I would like to thank the speakers for this very fascinating discussion, which started off with women's participation in labor forces and gender discrimination, but also ended up somehow in the in mythology and Greek myths and everything. So it also kind of gives us a glimpse of the kind of expansive range of this topic. And like Patrick said, this brick project idea in the beginning. So I think I'm really thankful for to both our speakers for a very very informative and insightful talk. As well as I would also like to thank the audience participation, because it was a really this participation really made the talk so engaging and such a good learning experience for all of us. And so from all of us here at the seminar and lecture series, I would like to thank all of you and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And see you, Alice, sometime physically.
Thank you.